Welcome to the 85th episode of the Flipped Learning Network podcast. I'm your host, Troy Cockrum. Joining me today is, again, my co-host, Joan Brown. And today we have on the show Mike Gorman. Mike, could you tell us about your role in education?
Yeah, thank you, Troy. First of all, great to be here. And my role basically probably began about 35, 36 years ago. That's how long I've been in the classroom, in and out of the classroom. Currently, I take care of a lot of what we call our innovative programs, and I'm located up here in Southwest Allen County Schools, just outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Also do some work with the Buck Institute, BIE, also with PBS, Discovery, and do some work with Allen November and some stuff on the side. So basically, I love to be involved in the classroom. I love working with kids, educators, and just trying to do things that just bring about that, what I like to call that student-centered learning.
And so we wanted to bring you on the podcast because I know you do a lot of work with project-based learning, and I've heard a lot of flipped teachers are finding ways to sort of merge them both or use some flipped methods inside a project-based learning classroom. And so we just wanted to talk more about what is project-based learning and how it can be used and how technology helps facilitate that. First, Mike, can you define project-based learning?
Great question. Project-based learning is what we consider learning and constructing through the use of a project. Much different than front-loading a bunch of instruction and delivering a bunch of instruction and then doing a project after it. I like to say that the project itself, in essence, facilitates the learning. And we can get into all the elements or whatever, but later on. But that's it in basically just a small capsule.
And I think I've noticed a lot that people say, well, I assign projects, so I do project-based learning, and that's really, when you get into what project-based learning is, that's not what it is.
No, you're exactly correct. Assigning projects, we can suddenly say, we're going to do this, this, and this, and we'll see you in 3 weeks with your project. That's not project-based learning. There's actually a lot of front-loading the teacher has to do beforehand, but then during the course of it, there still is a lot of scaffolding, a lot of in-time learning as students have needs to know. But you're right. It's really, a lot of us have been doing projects, but we haven't always been doing project-based learning.
Mike, I saw recently a self-check where teachers would ask themselves some reflective questions about whether or not it was really project-based learning. And one of the very first questions was, I assign projects at the end of a unit to assess their knowledge, or I assign it at the beginning. And I thought that was really a great starting point for teachers to think and look at the placement of something called a project that they devise, and whether or not it's used, as you say, to facilitate learning, or whether or not that's actually used as an assessment piece.
Yeah, I think what a way to start a survey. That is just awesome, because with that question, we can almost end the survey right after it. I think as we look at it, and one of the things we like to talk about at the Buck Institute a lot of times is that project that comes at the end that maybe reinforces the skills, that maybe goes over what was learned, there's really nothing wrong with it, but it's not project-based learning. We basically call those dessert projects. They're really not the main course. And there probably is some room for those in education, and I'm not saying that they are not a good thing, but they are definitely not what we call project-based learning, where the project is the base of the learning.
Mm-hmm. And just as it's happening here in Virginia, I just had a long conversation with an administrator today about this. They're removing some of the standardized tests in place of that is going to be a project. And once again, I feel that the idea is an end of a curriculum unit assessment. So I want to be sure and clarify for people that this is different. This is actually the student learning along the way when they do the project.
Exactly. The students learning, and I think what's really interesting that you say when we start looking at the test, it doesn't mean that within that scaffolding there can't be some quizzes and tests. I think we have to have that if we're going to always have standardized testing, ACT, SAT, AP. You know, we have to make sure our kids are test smart, and so, but it's scaffolded into the pieces, and so there's still this traditional within it. It's just how we put it all together.
And before we go a little bit too far into project-based learning, let's also differentiate between problem-based learning and project-based learning, because you hear a lot of them incorrectly used interchangeably. Can you sort of give us a synopsis of how they're different and how they're similar?
Basically, as we start looking at project-based learning is actually made up of, at least at the Buck Institute, we've identified 8 essential elements. Probably the most important is significant content. If there's not content in your project, why are we doing it? And that is so important. After that, we like to bring in the 4 C's, or the 21st century competencies. And what we say within that project is not only do you facilitate those, but you assess at least one of them. Then we also have things called the driving question, the need to know, revision and reflection, voice and choice, public audience, in-depth inquiry. All these are pieces of project-based learning. Now, problem-based learning a lot of times is an abbreviated type of project-based learning where maybe we're saying, tell you what, we maybe don't need as much voice and choice in this, or we don't need any public audience at all. And so a lot of times in inquiry-based learning, we will use an inquiry thing utilizing like the 5 E's or something like that in a science lesson or a math lesson, and the problem-based element will be a scaffolded piece of the project-based learning. A lot of times you will find, and you will see this a lot of times in some of the new tech high schools across the country, that a lot of times they will put their math areas a little more aligned with the problem-based, sometimes more than the project-based learning.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buck, you keep mentioning the Buck Institute, and I wanted to kind of clarify who they are. In my opinion, the Flip Learning Network was started to sort of give a definitive voice to what Flip Learning is, because it was starting to go in all these different directions, and so John Bergman and Aaron Sam started the Flip Learning Network to kind of guide that discussion about what is Flip Learning. And I feel like the Buck Institute is the definitive source of what is project-based learning. Is that a good assessment of what the Buck Institute is? Yeah,
I would say the Buck Institute, BIE, is probably one of the world leaders. It's a nonprofit world leader in project-based learning across not just the country but the world. We've got people right now doing working with people in Singapore. We had an actual conference over in Australia last fall. So we go across the world, much like the Flip Learning Network is doing right now. And I'm just fascinated with the work you guys are doing. I had a chance to talk with John in Chicago, and we actually talked about, he gave me this inspiration for my next ISTE presentation I'm doing this summer, and basically it's about how PBL and Flip Learning actually have some really cool connections with each other.
Yeah, that's a match that's perfect, because we have so little class time. And using that, of course, the face-to-face time so that you can mentor students during a project is outstanding use of class time. And that's what Flip does for you.
Yeah, and I think you hit that point. Anybody who's flipping, they're taking some. There's 2 different ways you can look at it. They're taking some of that content knowledge and putting it outside the class time, or we have also found a lot of times through video instruction, you can actually make the same content happen in like 50% of the time. So you can even use some of those videos within the classroom. But definitely what happens then is it opens up a lot of time for some of those higher level thinking skills. And then I like to say we can even push that flipped learning experience to front load the classroom that you have tomorrow in the project-based learning, where you give the kids some things to reflect and think about, which now front loads a possible lecture for the next day. So they both really work nicely with each other.
Absolutely. I have to talk a little bit in terms of age and what's going to be appropriate for certain age groups. When I look at project-based learning, so much of it is student inquiry and student choice, which we can look at our high school students and say, yes, they're mature enough, they can handle that, they know what questions to be asking to move forward. Middle school, where I am, that's going to take a little more guidance. Is there a point in which really it's not going to work in the elementary, or do we have to work in really small chunks? How do we introduce this to elementary students?
Great question. Especially as we go into the early L, sometimes we have a thing that's called an entry event, and I like to call it more of Marzano's advanced organizer, where we're taking past knowledge and we're trying to connect it to the new knowledge that the kids are going to have. And sometimes some of this, kids in K-2 don't have as much past knowledge, and so sometimes it's harder to pull up some of those connections. But PBL works great in the elementary school. I would say where I really draw the lines more is schools that have the culture set up for PBL versus those that may not. And because PBL, just like any type of technology integration, I know you've worked quite a bit with technology integration, good PBL is based on good school culture, and that kids are really practicing a reflective, metacognitive type activities. And the sooner we get our elementary kids starting to think that way, the better. And it's amazing. If you've ever visited any of the expeditionary learning schools, even in the elementary grades that utilize PBL, it's just fascinating to watch kids start to own their learning at such a young age.
I was very fortunate to get to visit this week HB Woodlawn in Arlington, and they offer, let's see if I've got the word right, independent learning days in their school, and it is a middle school where there is no set schedule per se, and the students can pursue a particular project. They can work on it, and they can move in different classrooms to different teachers for help or resources. I found that to be an excellent, example for me to take back. I know that culture is different than what I normally see in the classroom, but it's something to strive for.
I really like that. It's, so many times in project-based learning, what we try to tell people is, once you've gotten some things going, you're the facilitator. You are still really scaffolding all this, but sometimes the best learning then takes place when you get out of the way. And it sounds like maybe a day a week they're getting out of the way and letting the kids own some of that learning, which I think is so, what a wonderful idea as to possibly even let the kids build some of the content. And what if they built some of this content through videos, and we use some of their videos to flip the learning experience?
Sure. I love the way Troy will mention to his students that, hey, if there's any one of my videos that you would like to improve upon, be my guest. I think that's an excellent attitude to have with students.
And that's huge. And I think as we let kids do that, they're developing and understand. I can't tell you how many things I didn't understand until I taught it.
Yeah.
So if we have some teams at our school that are just now in the infancy of trying to do cross-curricular projects, could you provide me any kind of help or guidance how a team might develop a project for maybe a larger group of students?
Well, you bring up something that is can be really powerful, but also can work in not as such a powerful way. The minute you put teams together, What happens is, especially if you're cross-curricular, what will sometimes happen, and I started teaching 35 years ago, and it must have been about 20 years ago, we had this thing of interdisciplinary teaching. And with interdisciplinary teaching, people would come up with this idea, and then everybody would find a way to force fit their curriculum into the idea. And so, so we're going to have a PBL, they would call it, on the whales. And somebody would say, oh, we can draw whales. Somebody else will say, well, we'll read about a whale. Somebody else would say, we will, study the history of whales. Hopefully they got the mammal and not the country. But anyways, what ended up happening then is we forced into what I would call a not authentic learning experience. So I think the best way when you're working with a team is to, first of all, keep your learning real. Keep a focus on that. Think about what some of your content standards and objectives are. Where do they match? Where do they complement each other? Look at those types of things. And then here's the number one thing that I have found success in project-based learning, and that is try to keep your learning authentic in a way that's in some way you are trying to find a way to connect to your community. Look at that old building downtown. Look at that park. Look at the organizations within your town. What are the strengths and beauty and resources of your community? And then how can you, as a team of teachers, bring that in? You'll find your content to connect, but don't force it.
One resource that I've found helpful, and I'm going to ask you for some other resources, but pblu.org, they have online classes and projects that you can, example projects that you can go through and things like that. And I went through one of their classes maybe about a year ago, and found it a very good resource for how to structure a project-based unit. Can you tell more about that resource or other resources you think are good for learning about PBL?
Yeah, PBLU is excellent. Some great people. In fact, that is one of the BIE outreaches, and I know the instructors on that. And what's cool about it is it's one of those open source courses, absolutely free, and really give you some ideas on what PBL is and give you some resources with that. In fact, PBLU is we're trying to pilot this year where we're going to actually start a mentoring program for coaches that are supporting PBL in their districts. BIE.org, if you go there and you search their resources, they have a database of resources out there that connect to almost any subject you can find. Another one that I think has done a very good job, and I don't have the website in my mind up, but if you do a search for West Virginia space PBL, West Virginia has done a lot of great work and has a beautiful database and a beautiful template for a lot of PBL resource projects.
Have to definitely check that one out. I just know when I took the PBLU course, there were a lot of things I didn't know about project-based learning, that and like the entry event, learning more about how to structure an entry event and things like that. Things that I just never learned, and I thought I knew a lot about project-based learning. So that's why I said it's valuable to look into it more, because it's much more in depth than a lot of people realize.
Well, yeah, and you're right. And that entry event really is what drives it. You use that entry event and you base it on what we call a driving question, which is very different than a essential question. That a lot of times, I like to say that essential questions are built on the language of teacherese, okay, where driving questions are kid-centered, they're kid-based, and kids understand those questions, which is what kind of motivates that learning. And so it's one of those 8 elements. But you're absolutely correct. You can learn so many things, and what you will do when you take courses like this is, first of all, I think we have to honor all teachers. Teachers do an awesome job, and they have some excellent lessons and some excellent types of experiences that we've all given kids. And all we do in some of the courses, and when you go through project-based learning, is we honor those things and we say, okay, maybe you've always done this, but this is what our common language is, and this is what we call this, and this is what we do, and this is how it's possibly structured. And I'll tell you what, the number one thing that I will have people say to me after they're done with a workshop or a course is they will say, you know something, I think I was kind of more of one of those dessert project people. And it kind of creates that awareness. So Troy, you're absolutely correct. Just anything you can do with that is just awesome.
So what kind of reflection should a teacher do to know whether they've got it right? You know, it's easy to sit down and create a project and watch your students go through it, and you come to the end and you grade everything with rubrics. But how do you know that they really learned along the way? What kinds of things would you be looking for?
I think, first of all, just bringing up that idea reflection. The fact that somebody's stopping for a second and even doing that is a good first step. We have a hard time even getting that far. And so some of the things you start looking for is, let me look at my end project. And did my end project align with my beginning driving question? Did I answer that question? Number two, did I cover the content standards that I was supposed to cover, or I should say, did I allow the kids to uncover them? Okay. Were your kids engaged? Talk to your kids. Are you excited to do another one? Do you have, I remember the first time I did some things, and I would actually have some kids, we did some things where kids would get into photography, or they would use some things, and suddenly they're talking about, you know something, I have a new goal now because I did this. I'd love to get into some photojournalism, or I'd love to try. So you will know it. The minute your classroom's noisy, but the noisy sounds productive, you'll know you're getting there. We all know what unproductive noise sounds like, but we also know what productive noise sounds like, and it's amazing, and it's just so much fun to experience.
I have another question, more concerning performance. I've seen a few resources emphasize that the students need to have a final presentation of some kind, or they need to be able to speak to an expert at the end, or they need to publish. Where's that on the scale of importance for a project?
Basically what you're hitting on is, and sometimes we call it the ninth actual element, and that's authenticity. And the performance has to be authentic. The performance can be an ending paper, but it should possibly be published somewhere. Put onto a blog, put onto a wiki, put it onto your Google site, and let the world see that. It's not real. You do not practice all the other elements, because one of the elements is revision and reflection. Well, if all it's going to do is hang on your refrigerator at home, there's not a whole lot of reason to revise and reflect anything, other than if you're totally grade motivated. And some kids are, but not all kids are. And so I think bringing that authentic, giving them a real reason to do it. And when you bring in these experts and you bring in that audience, remember, the audience does not have to be, and that's why I love talking to people in the flipped area and technology integration. The audience doesn't have to be in your classroom. It could be anywhere. It could be Skype. It can be synchronous. It can be asynchronous. It can be, the audience can be part of the project at the start. It could be that you've built a forum where you have some experts that answer your kids' questions in a total asynchronous way. So what we're doing is we're connecting kids with reality, real learning experiences. I like to say, whenever we tell them what they're going to learn, there's always, you know, so this is what we're going to learn. Now, I think our next step is, so what? Why are we learning this? What are we going to do with it? And it's pretty hard to motivate kids when the so what is because you'll need it someday.
Well, and I like to say, I'll kind of expand on that, now that kids have so much easy access to information, Now it's what you do with that information that's important, and we need to be teaching our students how to use that information and not just find it and regurgitate it.
Oh, Troy, you are so correct. How many times have you ever seen kids, and this used to drive me nuts, not only do they find information, but they're not even evaluating what they're finding. You know, in fact, they're not even going to the website. I don't know how many times I would see somebody Google something, and they start taking notes from the Google landing page. and I would say, well, hold on, how are you even going to source that? Who put this out? Google. You know, almost like Google's writing all this stuff. And so I think you're absolutely correct that to find the information and then figure out what's right and what's wrong. How do we evaluate those things? And I could talk. That could be another. We could do another podcast on that.
Absolutely, because that is something that sometimes is neglected when it comes to a project-based learning environment, because the teacher doesn't have the time in class to spend time on website evaluation or can you judge a source, and so that kind of gets, so you'll see kids will pull from YouTube videos and stuff that we have no idea who made this. How would you know that information is correct?
Yeah, and Joan, as you look at that and you think about that, so many times that's where, if you take the flipped experience and you take the PBL experience, you suddenly open up that time. Because even in just the PBL class, I've seen in the traditional classroom that process not happen. I've seen my wife is a media specialist, teacher librarian, okay? And one of the things she has always said that she has to work hard at is teachers bring their kids down to the library, but a lot of times they're not into the process of research. It's help them find the information so they can get their report done.
Yes.
And so we have to remember that as educators, we have to find ways to help kids process this and internalize this and reflect on it. And that's the true learning. All of us can take something, paraphrase something, and throw it into a paper. But we really need to work on those. And that's why I say the flipped and the PBL together just finally give you that time to do some of those things.
So you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to expand on it more. What has technology done for PBL? I mean, we've had this influx of technology over the last 3-4 years. How has that changed, or how has that added to PBL?
Well, I think we have finally gotten to a place where technology, I'm an old guy. My first computer was a TRS-80. And I mean, Pet Commodore, if you remember some of those. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but when I first started using technology in the classroom, back with HyperCard, HyperStudio, all these types of things, what was so funny about it was I was spending too much of my time teaching the technology and I was losing the content. We are now good enough with our technology, and the kids are getting good enough with these things, that we can actually start using now the technology to amplify the content and to make it real for the kids. I have often said to people, I'll again show my age, but I'm a big believer in John Dewey and all of the progressive movement he did in the 40s. I wonder what would happen if John Dewey could wake up today and see all of the technology in the classroom. I wonder what he'd do with it. He would just be amazed. I think he would suddenly say, wow, all these things I thought about, we can now do. This, to me, is one of the most exciting times to be in education, because we can make the classroom real for our kids. We can take down the walls. We can do so many things because that technology is allowing it to do it. And the thing we have to remember as educators is to make sure that not only are kids using the technology to find and seek and clarify information, but they're using the technology to create and produce and make. And I think that's where we really come. Is I believe we have really turned it so that our kids can be producers of information, which I'm just so excited about. They can make their own knowledge.
Well, I have this poster in my room, and I'm trying to figure out who it is that said this. So anyone who knows can certainly write me after. But it says, if you want to be a carpenter, you'll apprentice with a master carpenter. If you want to be a learner, you should be apprenticing with a master learner. And what, in my opinion, is this has created, all teachers are now master learners rather than the master of all content.
And that's so important. First of all, we can't be the master of all content anymore. There's too much content out there. And so I think what we have to do is we have to help those kids decipher and learn how to learn. It's amazing. Even kids that are not in a flipped classroom, we can tell them, you know, something. You don't know how much. I wonder how many traditional classrooms out there have kids that go home at night and they still turn on some type of video to watch something that they learned about in class that day, even if it wasn't their teacher, because they didn't quite understand it. But that's that whole thing of when we did our e-learning program in my district, we used that this year to make up snow days. And one of our goals was not just to distribute the content, but how do we learn to learn beyond our classroom walls? And that was the #1 goal of our whole initiative, so that we could use it for years and years, and so kids could use the skills they got for years to years.
And that's really PBL in action as well.
Exactly.
Teaching learning. And so I bring that to now the business world. I know they're looking for certain skills, and I believe, doesn't PBL bring that to the forefront as far as the types of skills that the business world is looking for? They want entrepreneurs, they want critical thinkers.
I'm going to bring up that whole thing of every time I sit down with groups of teachers, we always talk about thinking about the goal with the end in mind. And so one of the first things we have to think about the end in mind is, what is the ideal graduate? And do you know 98% of the teachers I sit down with start naming the 21st century competencies and all of these types of things when we talk about what the ideal graduate is. Because I think, and that's not to say that the content is not important, but what it says is, I think some of the content's somewhat assumed anymore. And we have people all over the world that are going to know content. We have to go beyond the content. And employers are looking for people that can think for themselves, that have empathy, that have the critical thinking skills, that can collaborate. You know, those things are so important. And it is the way that our culture is moving, and I think kids need to become part of this.
So we can start to wrap it up here. Mike, how can the listeners find you? Do you blog? I'm sure you're on Twitter. How can my listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm at, first of all, on Twitter, I'm at MJ Gormans, Gormans. Okay, that's the Twitter handle. I also blog at 21 Century, and it's no ST in there, 21centuryedtech.wordpress.com. 21centuryedtech.wordpress.com. That's where you can get me there. Also do some blogging across the country. I take care of the blogs at the Siemens STEM Academy through Discovery Education and some things like that. But I'd love people. Feel free to connect with me anytime, because we can all learn from each other. You know, I just invite any new people to be part of my professional learning network, and I want to be part of yours.
And that is important, is that, you know, I was talking with somebody the other day, and they said, well, where did you find resources for flipped learning when you started 4 years ago? And I was just like, I just went on Twitter. I read people's blogs, because there weren't books out there. There wasn't a lot of resources, and you build that network that you find people that you can connect with, and you never know who's going to provide that piece of information or that project that you never thought of that just being connected can help you find.
And kids have to learn that too. They have to learn to build their networks, and through that, that's where we have to be sure as a school that we're helping guide them to do that. We're practicing good digital citizenship skills. We're having kids learn those types of things. I think it's important to their learning too.
And that reminds me, I had a talk with a teacher today. Her son's a musician in New York City, and he was playing at I guess a bar probably, and it was at midnight our time, and so she watched it live on the internet, streaming on the internet. She set her alarm for like 11:30, got out of bed and watched it live, and she was like talking about how amazing technology is that she could do that. And I said, huh. I wonder if we could implement things like that in the classroom. And then she kind of gave me a sneering look.
No. That's a great way to. I love that type of reflection. It really is awesome. Very cool.
Well, thanks for your time, Mike. It's been very helpful. We love project-based learning, and we may bring you on again because we kind of diverged into some other areas that we could, like you said, probably do a whole nother podcast on some other ideas. So.
Well, like I said, as all of you start looking at that journey, know that a lot of these initiatives we talk about today, whether it be one-to-one, whether it be flipped learning, whether it be project-based learning, whether it be looking at the Common Core, they really don't look them at a separate initiative. Start looking to see how they all really do work together. And I like to call it the #1 initiative, and that is putting students in the center of their own learning. That's what it's all about, and that's what these different types of initiatives are doing. And there's a bunch of educators that are really doing a really nice job of it, and we're in its infancy.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It's good to meet you, Mike.
Thank you, Joan. Good to meet you too.